And tied into the kind of story of things we've been talking about as well, AJ, mistakes. Clearly, again, in this game, they made mistakes. They shot themselves in the foot. No player goes into a game intending to make mistakes, clearly. But Town are doing it a lot. What, again, this is a hard question to answer, but I have a theory, is that there's a saying, isn't there, that the more you're aware of how important what you're doing is, the harder it is to do. So if you're walking along a bit of wood on the floor, no problem. Put that wood 100 feet up in the air, it's going to be a lot harder. And it feels to me like Town are maybe aware that they have to be at their best. They can't make any mistakes. They have to be perfect to be in with a chance of winning a game in the Premier League. And that inevitably then leads to tension, doesn't it? You go out there thinking, I've got to be perfect in this game. It feels to me like they may be carrying a little bit of pressure on themselves into each game.
Yeah, I think there's that. And I think that there's so many things that's got to be going on in these players' minds at any given moment. In these games, you're thinking about the players that you're coming up against. I think that in any game, you have that, whether it's against Salah, against Njai, against Haaland, against Adama Traore or whatever. You've got to think about the atmosphere around you. You've got to think about the importance of getting a result, what you need to do, the very specific instructions. Oh, I need to do this, and then that player's going to be there. And I think that in Town's case, it's so much harder because there are so many more things. They've got to think about new teammates. They've got to think about the higher level. For a lot of the players, it's much higher than they've ever played before. So with all of that going on, all it takes is a split second. All it takes is Wes Burns holding on for the ball for too long, like half a second too long, and he's lost it. And then you look up and it's in the back of the net. And that's what we've seen. And some of them are more frustrating than others. Some of them, I think, are just... I think to an extent, teething issues, and others are just ones that you're frustrated by. They didn't really come in the Championship, especially because everything was so gelled and you weren't punished as much, obviously. But these guys knew each other really, really well. You knew that, okay, I've got to clear this ball, and then I know that if I clear it this way, it's going to land for this player, and we can start the counter. And that's exactly what the manager's told me to do. And it's totally different in the Premier League. It's a different approach, different players, and they're professionals. They're going to have to get used to it and for it to click. And it's going to have to happen sooner rather than later. But I do just think it's just a lot of things to process. And if it takes you too long, you're going to have to pay the price for it.
You got any thoughts on this, Stu? Because as I say, clearly no one goes out there intending to make a mistake. And it's not as simple as McKenna just going, right, stop making mistakes, is it? It's a more complex and nuanced situation. But it does seem to be a recurring theme.
I think there's probably a lot in what you've just said in terms of knowing what the stakes are and a bit of tension at lower level. There's a bit more carefree abandon that we can play a certain way and we'll back ourselves. Even if we do concede, we back ourselves to undo the damage. And now there is going to be that little bit more doubt in your mind that if you go 1-2-0 down at this level, it's very difficult to come back from. So probably an element of that. I think there's an element of kind of new team chemistry coming into play. The patterns of play were so well embedded with the team that kind of had the back-to-back promotions, and everyone kind of knew where you were on and off the ball. They're probably still kind of getting to grips with that a little bit. We've talked about some of the injuries that have come into play. Some of these signings were made quite late in the transfer window. So they've just not been able to kind of bed in some of these key partnerships throughout the team. The international breaks obviously haven't helped with that as well, just in terms of just getting some momentum going in this season. The Aston Villa game, you draw 2-2. Was it international break off the back of that? No, it was West Ham, then the international break. But even so, it was, from Villa to Everton was 3 weeks from between games at Portman Road. And in the Championship, you might have had that Villa game, massive feel-good factor, even though it was a draw in that. You might have another game at Portman Road 3-4 days later. Now you're waiting 3 weeks for the next game, and some of that feeling has kind of dissipated. So there's probably a number of things that have gone into the nervy performances, but just probably being aware that sort of Everton and West Ham were opportunities, and not every game is going to be an opportunity. When you look at others sort of coming down the track, there's a good chance you're going to lose in certain games. So it does ramp up the pressure on certain fixtures, and maybe that played its part.